Good morning. I hope you're all feeling relaxed this morning. You may have seen in the program that what we are going to be talking about next is incredibly useful in being able to get to a person's highest intention. And I hear some of you are looking forward to being able to improve your negotiation skills. I just had one of those weekends. You know, I'm sure you've had one of them too. You just sit and don't feel like doing very much, just hanging around at home, watching TV. There never seems to be much on though, does there? So there I was, sitting in front of the TV like you are right now, and saw that one of my favorite childhood movies was on, The Karate Kid. Not the remake, but the original. And that was so much better than the remake, don't you think? You know, the story is about a young boy who's been bullied, so he decides to go to the local karate legend and asks him to teach him how to fight. The old man's name was Mr. Miyagi, and he agreed to help Daniel. As agreed, Daniel returned to Mr. Miyagi the next morning, ready to learn to defend himself. To his surprise, Mr. Miyagi asked him to please do something for him. He needed to wax his car, but he was not to follow just any process. He had to rub the wax on in a circular motion. Do you remember? And rub it off in a circular motion. Wax on, wax off. Wax on, wax off. Being a good kid, Daniel did as he was asked, believing that when the car was done, that he would learn how to fight. But it was not to be so. When he was done, and it took a long time to get done, Mr. Miyagi thanked him and said goodbye. Daniel was a little annoyed. He had worked hard, but learned nothing. But Mr. Miyagi said he should return the next day, so Daniel thought to himself, okay, he'll surely teach me tomorrow. The next morning, Daniel was back at Mr. Miyagi bright and early and ready to learn. Mr. Miyagi said that he just had another task for him, please. Daniel could not refuse, could he? So he watched as Mr. Miyagi demonstrated to him how to sand his deck. And just like with the car, there was a special way Mr. Miyagi wanted it done. Right circle, left circle. Right circle, left circle. And when Daniel did it slightly differently, he was corrected. Mr. Miyagi showed him again how he had to sand. Right circle, left circle. And then to Daniel's surprise, Mr. Miyagi said goodbye and left him to his task. This was a little much for Daniel. As he sanded, in the way he had been shown, he seethed a little. It seemed that this old man was just using him. But he also thought maybe this was just his way of taking payment, so he continued, slowly getting the sanding strokes just right. Mr. Miyagi was pleased with his work when he came back, and said he would see Daniel the next morning. Daniel could feel the annoyance rising in him. When was he going to be able to be taught how to fight? But he kept his anger back and went home. On the third day, to Daniel's annoyance, Mr. Miyagi wanted him to paint his fence. And yes, you're right, not just in any way, in a very particular way. Side to side, up and down. Side to side, up and down. Daniel, a little more angry than before, did as he was told. It was tiring work, and he got angrier and angrier. Mr. Miyagi disappeared out of the gate. At the end of the very long day, Daniel was seething. He could not understand why he was not getting what he was promised. Mr. Miyagi had agreed to teach him, and yet, just then Mr. Miyagi came back. Daniel went right up to him, boiling with anger. And the next movie that came on was a strange remake of a Cinderella story brought into the 20th century. It reminded me so much of my grandmother. She had a box of sewing notions that sat on a side table in the lounge, so she could sew when she was watching TV. Whenever we visited her, though, she was always managed to bump over the box, which would fall to the floor, spilling the buttons, studs, threads across the floor. Oh dear, she would say, won't you be a sweetie and tidy that up for me? I would then spend ages carefully putting everything back into the box, making sure that first I sorted out the button colors, and then made sure all the same size buttons went into one section of the sewing box. Then the threads were sorted into color. She never seemed to finish a reel of cotton, so there were lots of reels of the same color. and they too had the right spot. Now that I'm older, I realize that she had a devious plan whenever I visited. By getting me to repack the box, she kept a young child quiet and busy. So in the movie, there was of course the sweet heroine and her two nasty stepsisters and her stepmother. No working among the cinders though. The family had a clothing company. Now the young girl was very keen to be part of the family business. But every time she asked if she could come to the factory after school, she was told no. This went on for ages. But finally, one day the stepmother said she could work there in the school holidays. She was so excited. Now her stepmother was the vice president of the company, and although the stepsisters had zero talent, other than talking themselves up, they were senior designers in the company. Our heroine had to report to them, and I'm sure you can think how that went. That's right. They told her that she had to work her way up by starting at the bottom, and they took her to a room, the button room, and opened the door. It was filled with buttons and fastenings of every possible kind and in every possible color. Tidy this, they said with a laugh, and walked away. Our heroine is not someone to give up or be put down. She set about her task, sorting out the buttons into size and color and shape and what it was made from. She put the press studs into sizes, and before she knew it, the button room was tidy. She quickly left the room to find her stepsisters. They were in the cafeteria drinking tea. She later told me the looks on her stepsisters' faces were a sight to see. They were so angry she was done so soon. But they took her to another room, the fabric room. And as you've guessed already, haven't you? That room too was in a complete mess. Tidy it, they said, then they tripped away laughing. Our heroine set about her task without blinking. First she sorted the fabric according to type, natural fiber and synthetic. Then she sorted each type into weight. Heavy fabrics for winter, light fabrics for summer. Then she sorted these groups again, this time whether they were patterned with objects, patterned with stripes, patterned with checks, or just plain. And that plain fabric she broke these groups down again into colors. She was pleased with her work. She quickly left the room to find her stepsisters. Now they were in the cafeteria eating lunch. She later told me the looks on her stepsisters' faces were a sight to see when she walked into the cafeteria. "You can't be done already," they shouted. "We are sure that you made a mess." But when they went to inspect the work, everything was just right. Though they took her to another room, feeling like they were fighting a war. And the Great War, the war to end all wars, started on 28 July 1914. And by the time it ended, about 15 million men had been killed. If you were to ask people why the Second World War started, chances are you'd get a quick reply. German expansion, Hitler are the likely answers. But ask someone why the First World War was started, and I'm sure you will find that they are stumped. At best, they may be able to say something about an archduke, or the shot ran out around the world. But my story is not about why the war started. It's about what happened. World War I, as I'm sure you know, was fought mainly in the trenches. This was because new inventions like barbed wire and machine guns made it almost impossible to cross open ground like soldiers had done in the past. So they dug trenches. These were long ditches of about 2.1 meters deep and 1.8 meters wide that ran along the battlefront. Each side, the Germans on the one and the French, Belgian and English on the other, occupied a trench that ran parallel to the enemy's. On the signal from an officer, The men would climb out of the trench and run across no man's land and attempt to kill the soldiers in the other trench. As you can imagine, running bravely across an open piece of land while someone is able to stand and take a shot at you is a very risky business. And it is no wonder that 1,120,000 men died at the Battle of the Somme. Between 700 and 975,000 men died at the Battle for Verdun. When you consider life in the trenches, though, you may begin to understand why the men were prepared to leave the safety of the trenches. The sanitation was appalling. There were rats that ran up and down, eating from corpses and whatever else they could. When it rained, and you know it rains a lot in Europe, the trenches filled with water, and you had to stand in cold mud and fight and live. And then there was the problem of the lice. What was remarkable, though, was that the trenches were often as close as 30-odd meters apart. This meant that you could literally hear the enemy a few meters away from you. One soldier has said that, left up to the men in the trenches, this alone would have encouraged them to stop fighting and end the war. Of course, the generals did not agree. In September 1914, Pope Benedict XV was elected as the new pope. He immediately called for a truce, but to no avail. He then called for there to be a truce at least for Christmas, but the warring countries ignored him. Fighting went on. Christmas Eve 1914 was a cold and frosty moonlit night by the accounts of the soldiers who survived the war. They noted that there was an incredible silence in the cold air, and then, in the British trenches, they heard the very surprising sound of men singing, Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. The Christmas carol is so famous that even though nobody could speak German, they knew what was being sung. Soldiers found themselves humming quietly to themselves, Silent Night, Holy Night. The singing spread along the German trenches, and soon the men on the opposite side joined in. When the carol was done, an Englishman started to sing, and soon his whole battalion were singing along in the still air. And when they were done, the Germans answered back with another carol. What was going on? One of the lookouts was astounded to see some Germans climbing out of their trench, but there was no whistle to drive them out, no signal, they had no guns in their hand. Was this a trap? How would you like to be able to learn better than you have before, because you can move beyond just taking in information, but towards creating categories and distinctions between information so you can organize it better? And of course, improve your skills at memorizing things. Is that something that would appeal to you? What would life look like for you if you could increase your ability to analyze and synthesize information and therefore to solve problems more easily as you become more specific and more precise? How would that help? And how would your relationships improve if you were able to come to agreement with others more quickly? Today, we'll be learning about a technique that is useful for these and a number of other reasons too. A strong influence on the development of NLP was Alfred Korzybski's general semantics. He spoke of what he called the ladder of abstraction. He said it is possible to move further and further from an idea, and our language becomes vaguer and vaguer, and yet we still expect people to understand what we mean. NLP has a solution though. We label the process of moving up or down the ladder of abstraction chunking. When we chunk up, we start with the details and work up to the overview. Chunking down means breaking down an abstract overview into ever more precise details. In essence then, chunking defines the relationships between pieces of information. It puts them into a hierarchy of ideas. Now, chunking is jargon from computing, and simply means to organize information into groups. A group consists of chunks of information, all with something in common. A key point to remember is that you decide exactly what the pieces have in common. In 1956, George Miller published a paper that is still regarded as useful today. In his paper, The Magic Number 7 plus or minus 2, he suggested after research that our conscious mind seems to be able to cope consciously with about 5 to 9 pieces of information at any one time. You may have heard this as being told that you're able to hold 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information in your short-term memory at any one time. This might seem a little, but remember, a chunk of information can be just a single digit or a very rich and detailed piece of information, a sentence or a paragraph of information. It depends on how you put the chunks together. Chunk size varies from person to person, and even from topic to topic for that person. Chunk size also tends to grow in size as you become more familiar with the material. We each tend to operate from a particular level of chunking, from the specific detail to the global picture, from the global to the specific, and everything in between. I'm a global picture type of person. Just give me the big picture, that's all. My husband, on the other hand, is a detailed person. And this is a typical conversation at the end of the day. Me: how was your day? Him: well, as you know, I left early, but this did not help. Just around the corner, a blue Mazda was blocking the road as this woman and her 2 kids walked slowly out of the house and got into the car. When he finally pulled off, and so on, and so on. Him: how was your day? Me: fine. You can see why it is that people can be misunderstood and misunderstand each other based on chunk size and level now, can't you? Most people have a preferred chunk level. Some like to synthesize, to build the bigger chunks from the smaller details. They understand the parts first and then the whole. Others like to analyze. They like to start with the big chunks and then address the smaller parts. They understand the whole first and then the parts. I think it's easier to start with chunking down. Chunking down means that you move from generalities to specifics. This can mean moving from a whole concept or object, like from school to classroom, or moving from a class of things to an example. For instance, school as a class of education, among higher education and vocational education, to technical school or remedial school. Chunking down from whole to part is analysis. Analysis helps you to understand the parts by relating them to the whole. Chunking down helps you become more specific and precise. You can do this by asking, what is a part of this whole? What is a part of the school? Answer: a classroom, a staff room, a sports field. To chunk down from class of things to example, ask, what is an example of this class of things? So what is an example of wild animals? Class of things. Herbivores, predators. You'll get a chance to try some chunking down in a bit, but let's talk first about chunking up. Chunking up moves from the specific to the general. You start with the smaller parts and move up to the larger. Chunking up from part to whole is called synthesis. It helps you to understand the whole by seeing how it is made up from the parts and how the parts relate. When you chunk up, you get a category or object that contains the smaller chunk, but also contains other examples or other parts of that category or object. One of my colleagues prefers to chunk up rather than down. So whenever there is a new project, you can imagine what hell I go through while I wait for her to put each piece of the puzzle together, each resource delineated, and then a decision made on what they can do towards the project. I'd much prefer it if she started with the outcome and asked, so what do I need to do this? To chunk up from part to whole, you can ask, what whole is this part of? What whole is classroom part of? The answer is school. You can also go from example to class of things. You ask, what class of things is this an example of? The answer is school. It's also possible to chunk sideways within a class of things or within a set of examples. Desk, chair, chalkboard are all examples of classroom furniture. What is important though when chunking sideways is you know what the higher level class of things is. So chair and desk could also be examples of office furniture, a different class of things to classroom furniture. Before we go on to an exercise, let's take a look at where chunking can help you when working with a client. Chunking up and down has a lot of value in coaching. When I'm working with the clients on their outcomes that they are not achieving, I find that I can get them to chunk down from an outcome by asking, what prevents you from achieving this outcome? To assist a client in appreciating their outcomes, I chunk up and ask, if you got this outcome, what would that get you? When you are working as an NLP practitioner, you can explore intentions and behaviors by asking, what other behavior would also satisfy this intention? This is chunking down. And what is the intention behind this behavior? That's chunking up. As you can see in coaching, chunking up is a way of creating wider choices and more mental space, while chunking down helps you help the client become more specific and precise. From what you know of the Milton model, the meta model and metaphors that you've learned already, you will appreciate that there are examples of different types of chunking, aren't there? The Milton model is an example of chunking up language. It goes from the specific to the general. The meta model chunks down language. It goes from the general to the specific. And metaphor is an example of chunking cross language. It compares one experience with another using simile, metaphor, or analogy. Okay, let's move on to the exercises. We're going to do 2 exercises. The first one is some practice in chunking up and down and sideways using objects as starting points. And then the second is actually putting chunking into practice in your personal life. How? So I'm going to give you the name of an object to write in the middle of a piece of paper. Then I'll call out up, sideways or down, and you must chunk up to a class of things, chunk sideways to similar things, or chunk down to an example of the thing. In each instance, we'll use the first object as our starting point. For example, I'll start with the word chair. Up, furniture. Down, armchair. Sideways, dining room chair. Okay, so you've got the hang of it now. Let's put it to use in your personal life. I'd like you to think about something you want to accomplish or to change in your life. Got it? So, on the handout in part 1, you'll find some guiding questions to help you explore this thing you want to accomplish or change by chunking up, chunking sideways, or chunking down. Take some time answering the questions, and then do part 2. Here you'll need to do some reflection on your answers. I'll give you about half an hour for that activity. Welcome back. What do you need to ask me? What must you tell me? When you go on to do the Master Practitioner course, you're going to look at meta programs. Our meta programs are one of the filters through which information is deleted, distorted, or generalized. You'll remember that from the NLP communication model. The information chunk filter looks at how people like to receive information, as details or as global chunks or combinations of that. Now that you can confidently chunk up, down and sideways, think about a time in the future when you're having a disagreement with someone and can apply this thinking. Notice how it makes you feel. Notice how it's working for you. How do you think in the future being able to solve problems by chunking down to take the problem apart will assist you with working with people? What will that be like? Could you think of a time in the future when you can use these skills to negotiate a settlement by chunking up to establish the highest level of agreement before chunking back down again? Notice how it makes you feel as you achieve your goal. The hierarchy of ideas is going to be a very useful tool going forward, don't you think? And soon the English soldiers realized that the Germans were still singing as they moved unarmed into the no man's land. One brave soul climbed out of the English trench, and when no harm came to him, others started to do the same. In some places, it was reported that impromptu soccer games started. I was told of a story of a man who even had his hair cut by the German barber who had cut his hair before the war started. Soon, nearly 100,000 men were out of their trenches, not fighting, but wishing each other a Merry Christmas, singing carols, and being at peace. They had seen past the differences and called their own Christmas truce. In this room was a sewing machine and a pattern. "Now you're ready to work," they said. "We'll give you 2 hours to make something." With their usual cackles, they strolled out. Well, our heroine was able to dash to the fabric room and easily and effortlessly choose the best fabric, weight, color, and pattern. She stopped into the button room, grabbed 4 perfect buttons from the 3rd shelf on the right, and went back to the sewing room, where she cut and sewed a beautiful dress in no time. She quickly left the room to find her stepsisters, and as Daniel started to complain about how badly he'd been treated, Mr. Miyagi unleashed a furious barrage of strikes right at Daniel. Before he knew what he was doing, Daniel had successfully blocked every move.